When Marcus walked through our front door with his secretary Natasha and a 3-month-old baby she claimed was his, telling me he was moving them into our dream mansion while I should find somewhere else to live, he thought he was discarding a helpless housewife. What he didn't know was that I had just discovered his secret real estate empire worth $7 million and a network of shell companies that would unravel everything he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By the time I was finished, Natasha would learn exactly what kind of man fathers children while married to someone else, and Marcus would discover that the woman he called just a homemaker could systematically destroy everything he thought he owned. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I was standing in the kitchen of our beautiful colonial home, the one Marcus and I had saved for 5 years to buy, making his favorite blueberry pancakes and humming along to the morning news. The spring sunshine streamed through the bay windows I had chosen specifically for this moment, creating the perfect domestic scene I had worked so hard to create. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 3 months ago, I thought I was living the perfect American suburban dream. I was married to Marcus Mitchell, a successful commercial property manager who seemed to have an uncanny ability to find undervalued properties and turn them into profitable investments. We lived in Maplewood Heights, an exclusive neighborhood where the houses were large, the lawns were immaculate, and everyone seemed to have achieved that elusive work-life balance. I had been a real estate attorney before Marcus and I got married 4 years earlier. I was good at my job, really good. I specialized in property law, contract negotiations, and due diligence for commercial real estate transactions. I loved the intellectual challenge of parsing through complex legal documents, identifying potential issues, and protecting my client's interest. But when Marcus and I decided to start a family, he had convinced me to take a step back from my demanding career. Sarah, he had said with that confident smile that had first attracted me to him at a real estate conference 7 years ago, we're going to have children soon. They deserve a mother who can be fully present for them, not someone who's constantly stressed about deadlines and court appearances. Besides, my business is taking off. I can support us both while you focus on creating the family we want. At the time, it had seemed romantic, even progressive. Marcus was offering to be the breadwinner so I could be the kind of mother I'd always dreamed of being. I had visions of school pickups, homework help, family dinners where we actually talked to each other instead of checking our phone. I wanted to be the opposite of my own mother who had worked 70-hour weeks as a corporate lawyer and missed most of my childhood milestones. So I had gradually reduced my caseload, referring clients to other attorneys, and eventually closing my small but successful practice. For the past 2 years, I had been a full-time homemaker, managing our household, planning our social calendar, and preparing for the children we kept saying we'd have when the timing was right. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly Marcus had orchestrated my professional isolation. He had never explicitly asked me to quit working, but he had made it increasingly difficult for me to maintain my career. He would schedule important social events during my court dates, express disappointment when work kept me late, and subtly suggest that my stress levels were affecting our relationship. "You're so much happier when you're not dealing with difficult clients," he would say after I'd had a particularly challenging day. "I love seeing you relaxed and content. That's the woman I fell in love with." Gradually, I had convinced myself that he was right. I was happier focusing on our home, our relationship, our future family. I threw myself into the role of perfect wife with the same intensity I had once brought to legal brief. I learned to cook elaborate meals, maintained our house like a showplace, and networked with other wives in our social circle to support Marcus's growing business. Marcus's business had indeed been thriving. Coastal Property Solutions, the company he had founded 3 years into our marriage, seemed to have the golden touch with real estate investment. He specialized in finding distressed commercial properties, negotiating favorable purchase terms, and either renovating them for resale or converting them into profitable rental property. The secret, he would tell potential investors at the dinner parties I organized, is seeing potential where others see problems. A vacant strip mall isn't just an eyesore, it's an opportunity. A neglected office building isn't a liability, it's a future success story. I had been proud of his success, proud to be married to someone so visionary and entrepreneurial. At neighborhood gatherings, other wives would comment on how lucky I was to have such a successful husband, how secure I must feel knowing Marcus was such a good provider. Marcus made sure I felt included in his success, even though I wasn't directly involved in the business. He would come home excited about new deals, describing properties he was considering and asking for my opinion on renovation ideas. He never made me feel like my input wasn't valuable, even though I suspected he had usually already made his decisions before our conversations. What do you think about converting the second floor of the Riverside building into luxury apartment? He would ask over dinner, spreading architectural plans across our dining room table. The location is perfect for young professionals who want to be close to downtown but don't want to live in the city. I would study the plans, offer suggestions about layout or amenities, and feel useful, included, valued. Marcus would listen thoughtfully, sometimes incorporating my ideas into his final plans. I felt like we were building something together, even if my contribution was indirect. Our social life revolved around Marcus's business network. We attended charity galas where he cultivated relationships with potential investors, hosted dinner parties for clients and business associates, and spent weekends at the country club where Marcus played golf with other successful businessmen. I had become skilled at these social interactions, charming wives while Marcus impressed their husbands, creating the kind of connections that led to new business opportunities. The wives in our social circle were mostly like me, educated women who had stepped back from their careers to support their husbands' ambitions. We talked about home renovations, vacation destinations, and charity work, but rarely about our own professional aspirations or intellectual interests. It was a comfortable life, but looking back, I realize how intellectually stifling it had become. I should have noticed the changes in Marcus's behavior earlier. Over the past 6 months, he had been working longer hours, taking more business trips, and seemed increasingly distracted even when he was home. He would spend hours on the phone discussing deals, often stepping outside or into his home office when calls came in. "Sorry, honey," he would say, kissing my cheek as he headed for privacy. "Confidential client information. You know how it is." I did know how it was. In my legal career, I had handled plenty of sensitive information that couldn't be discussed casually. Professional discretion was something I understood and respected, so when Marcus became more secretive about his work, I assumed it was simply a sign that his business was handling bigger, more complex deals. The business trips had become more frequent too. Marcus was always flying somewhere to look at properties, meet with investors, or close deals. He would be gone for 3 or 4 days at a time, returning home with stories about promising investment opportunities and new business relationships. "The market in Charlotte is incredible right now," he would tell me after a recent trip. "I found 3 properties that could be absolute gold mines with the right renovations. The local investors are very interested in partnering with someone who has our track record." I had been supportive, even excited about these opportunities. Marcus's success meant our security, our future, the comfortable life we were building together. If his business required more travel and longer hours, that was the price of success. But there had been other changes too, subtler ones, that I had tried to ignore. Marcus had started paying more attention to his appearance, buying expensive clothes and grooming products he had never shown interest in before. He had joined an upscale gym and hired a personal trainer, claiming he needed to stay competitive in a business where image mattered. "Investors want to work with people who look successful," he had explained when I commented on his new wardrobe. "Perception is reality in commercial real estate. If I look like someone who knows how to make money, people are more likely to trust me with their money." It had made sense at the time. Marcus had always been attractive, but now he seemed almost obsessed with his appearance. He spent longer getting ready in the mornings, bought a new luxury watch, and started using cologne he had never worn before. Most tellingly, he had become less interested in physical intimacy. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Marcus had been affectionate and romantic, but over the past several months he seemed tired when he came home, distracted during conversations, and emotionally distant, even when we were spending time together. "It's just work stress," he would say when I asked if everything was okay. This business is demanding, but it's going to pay off for us in the long run. I need you to be patient while I build something that will secure our future." I had been patient. I had been understanding. I had continued playing the role of supportive wife while pushing down my growing concerns about the distance between us. I told myself that successful marriages required sacrifice, that Marcus was working hard for both of us, that our temporary struggles would lead to long-term happiness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone call that would change everything came on a Monday evening in early April. Marcus was supposed to be in Atlanta for a week, negotiating a complex commercial property deal. I was cleaning up after dinner, planning to spend the evening reading and maybe calling my sister Emma, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, with an Atlanta area code. I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be a telemarketer, but something made me pick up. "Hello? Is this Sarah Mitchell?" The voice was female, young, with a slight southern accent. "Yes, this is Sarah. Who is this?" "My name is Natasha Coleman. I work with your husband Marcus at Coastal Property Solutions." I knew that name. Marcus had mentioned Natasha several times over the past few months. She was his new administrative assistant, recently hired to help manage the increasingly complex demands of his growing business. According to Marcus, she was young but extremely capable, with a background in business administration and an intuitive understanding of real estate markets. "Oh, hello, Natasha," I said, wondering why she was calling me directly. "Is everything all right? Is Marcus okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Natasha spoke again, her voice sounded strained, almost nervous. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm calling because I think there's something you need to know about Marcus, about us." The words hit me like a physical blow. There was an us that included my husband and his young assistant. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" I managed to ask, though my heart was already racing with dread. "I've been seeing Marcus for the past 4 months," Natasha said, her words coming out in a rush. "I know he's married. I know this is terrible, but I need you to know that it's serious. We're in love, and we're planning a future together." I sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs, staring at the remnants of the dinner I had prepared for myself, the carefully set table for one that had become too common in recent months. "I don't understand," I said, though of course I understood perfectly. "Marcus is in Atlanta on business." "Marcus is here with me," Natasha said, gently. "We're looking at properties together." "Not for business, Mrs. Mitchell, for us. We're planning to move in together, and I thought you deserved to know before he tells you himself." The kitchen seemed to spin around me. 4 months. While I had been making his favorite meals and supporting his career and patiently waiting for him to come home from his business trips, he had been building a relationship with another woman. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. "I'm here." "There's something else," Natasha continued, and I could hear what sounded like a baby crying in the background. "I have a daughter. Her name is Isabella, and she's 3 months old. Marcus is her father." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the kitchen floor. 3 months old. Marcus had a 3-month-old daughter with his secretary while telling me we weren't ready for children yet. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. "I have to go," I said. "Mrs. Mitchell, wait. I know this is a shock, but Marcus wanted me to tell you that he'll be home tomorrow to discuss arrangements." "He'll explain everything then." "Arrangements?" As if the end of our marriage was a business transaction to be negotiated. I hung up without saying goodbye, and sat in my perfect kitchen, in my perfect house, surrounded by the perfect life I had built while my husband created an entirely different life with someone else, a life that included the child I had been told we couldn't afford to have yet. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of disbelief, anger, and desperate attempts to understand how I had missed the signs that were now so obvious. I didn't sleep, barely ate, and spent most of the night walking through our house, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't my home anymore. It was a stage set where I had been performing the role of happy wife while the real story was happening somewhere else entirely. Marcus arrived home Tuesday evening, looking tanned and relaxed in a way that now seemed obscene. He walked through the front door carrying his usual business trip luggage, acting as if this were any other homecoming. "Sarah," he said, setting down his suitcase and looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, calculating, guilty but defiant. "I know," I said simply. "Natasha called me." His face flickered with what might have been relief. At least he wouldn't have to pretend anymore. "Good," he said, loosening his tie. "That saves us both some awkward conversation. We need to talk about what happens next." I stared at this man I had been married to for 4 years. This stranger who was discussing the end of our marriage like it was a minor scheduling conflict. "You have a baby," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Isabella. She's beautiful." For the first time since he'd walked in, Marcus's expression softened with genuine emotion. "Sarah, I know this is difficult, but this isn't something that just happened. Natasha and I have been planning for months. We want to build a life together, raise Isabella together. While you were married to me, our marriage was already over," Marcus said with startling coldness. "We both know that. We've been living like roommates for months. You've been focused on playing house, and I've been building a business. There's no passion left between us, no real connection." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I had been focused on supporting his dreams, while he had been systematically planning to replace me. "What about our plans?" I asked. "Our future, the children we were going to have?" "Sarah, be realistic. You're 34 years old. If we were going to have children, we would have had them by now. You keep talking about someday, but someday never comes. Natasha is 25. She's given me what you couldn't." The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. But underneath the pain, I felt something else stirring. Anger, pure, cold anger at being dismissed and discarded by someone who had convinced me to give up my career for our relationship. "So what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I want a divorce. Clean, simple, no contest. The house will need to be sold so we can split the assets fairly. I'll give you enough to get started somewhere else, maybe a condo downtown. You can go back to work, rebuild your legal career. It'll be good for you to have purpose again." As if managing his life and supporting his ambitions hadn't been purpose enough. "And you and Natasha will do what?" "We've been looking at properties. There's a beautiful estate in Riverside Hills that would be perfect for raising Isabella. 5 bedrooms, 3 acres, excellent schools nearby." We put an offer in yesterday. Riverside Hills, the most exclusive neighborhood in our area, where houses started at $2 million. The neighborhood Marcus and I had driven through on weekends, fantasizing about the home we might afford someday, if his business continued to grow. "How exactly are you planning to afford a house in Riverside Hills?" I asked. Marcus looked uncomfortable for the first time since he'd arrived home. "The business has been very successful. I've been saving, investing wisely. Natasha has some family money that's helping with the down payment." Something about his answer felt wrong, rehearsed. In 4 years of marriage, Marcus had never mentioned having enough money saved for a $1 million property. Our own house, which we had bought for $400,000, had required every penny of our combined savings, plus a substantial mortgage. But I didn't push the issue. Not yet. I was still processing the fact that my marriage was ending, that my husband had a child with another woman, that my entire life was about to be dismantled and redistributed according to Marcus's preference. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course, but Sarah, I hope we can handle this maturely. We're both adults. We both know this marriage isn't working. Let's end it gracefully and move on with our lives." Maturely, gracefully. As if there was anything mature or graceful about abandoning your wife for your pregnant secretary. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed in our guest room, I sat in his home office, trying to understand how our finances could support the kind of property purchase he was describing. Marcus had always handled our money, claiming his business background made him better suited for financial planning. I had trusted him completely, focusing on household management while he managed our investments and saving. But now, looking through his desk drawers for bank statements or investment records, I found almost nothing. A few documents related to our house, some insurance papers, but nothing that showed the kind of substantial savings that would be required for a Riverside Hills estate. In the back of one drawer tucked behind a stack of business cards, I found something that made my heart race with recognition, a manila folder labeled, Property Holdings, Personal in Marcus's careful handwriting. I opened the folder and stared at documents that made no sense. Property deeds for buildings I had never heard of, purchase agreements for commercial real estate deals that weren't part of Coastal Property Solutions, bank statements for accounts I didn't know existed. According to these documents, Marcus personally owned 6 commercial properties throughout the state, worth a combined total of over $4 million, office buildings, retail centers, apartment complexes, all purchased in his name alone, over the past 3 years. I sat back in his chair, staring at evidence of a financial life I had been completely excluded from. This wasn't business success he had shared with me. This was wealth he had accumulated secretly, systematically, while telling me we needed to be careful with money and couldn't afford to start a family yet. My real estate law background kicked in automatically as I studied the documents. These weren't legitimate business investments. The purchase prices were suspiciously low, the financing arrangements were unusual, and several of the properties had been flipped multiple times in short periods. More disturbing, many of the transactions involved shell companies with names I didn't recognize, limited liability companies with generic names like Mountain View Holdings and Sunset Properties LLC, that had no apparent business operations beyond holding these real estate assets. This wasn't just secret wealth. This looked like money laundering, tax evasion, or some other form of financial crime hidden behind a network of shell companies and fraudulent transactions. I photographed every document with my phone, my legal training taking over even as my personal world crumbled around me. Whatever Marcus was hiding, it was bigger than an affair and a secret baby. It was a systematic deception that had been going on for years. By the time I closed the folder and put everything back exactly where I had found it, I had made a decision. Marcus wanted a clean, simple, uncontested divorce because he thought I was too naive and dependent to fight back. He was about to learn that the woman he had dismissed as just a homemaker still remembered how to be a very dangerous attorney when someone tried to defraud her. The war was just beginning, and Marcus had no idea what he was up against. The next morning, Marcus left for what he claimed was another business trip, this time to Tampa to finalize a major property acquisition. He kissed my cheek with the same casual affection he might show a sister, picked up his overnight bag, and walked out of our house as if the previous evening's conversation had been about something as mundane as changing our cable package. "I'll be back Thursday," he said from the door. "We can continue our discussion about the divorce arrangements then. I think you'll find I'm being very fair with the settlement terms." Fair. The word echoed in my mind as I watched his Mercedes pull out of our drive. 4 years of marriage, a successful legal career abandoned to support his ambitions, and now he was graciously offering to be fair about dividing assets I was beginning to suspect weren't even legitimately his. The moment his car disappeared around the corner, I was back in his office, this time with a much more systematic approach to my investigation. My years as a real estate attorney had taught me that complex financial schemes always left paper trails, no matter how carefully the perpetrators tried to hide them. The key was knowing where to look and what questions to ask. I started with the property deeds I had found the night before, cross-referencing them with public records using the online database access I still maintained through my old law firm. What I discovered made my hands shake as every single property Marcus supposedly owned had been purchased for significantly below market value from sellers who had defaulted on their mortgages or were facing foreclosure. But the transactions weren't straightforward distressed property sales. Instead, Marcus had used a complex web of shell companies to purchase these properties through what appeared to be fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings. The pattern was sophisticated and systematic. Marcus would identify commercial properties whose owners were struggling financially, often small business owners or elderly investors who had fallen behind on mortgage payment. Then, through a network of shell companies and corrupt intermediaries, he would initiate bogus bankruptcy proceedings that allowed these properties to be sold for fractions of their actual value. Mountain View Holdings LLC, one of the shell companies listed in his files, had purchased a thriving strip mall in downtown Clearwater for $180,000 from an elderly widow whose late husband had owned the property free and clear. According to public records, the strip mall was generating $40,000 per month in rental income, and should have been worth at least $1 or $2 million. But somehow, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez had been forced to sell through a bankruptcy proceeding she claimed she never initiated. I found Miss Rodriguez's phone number through a reverse directory search and called her, introducing myself as an attorney investigating irregularities in commercial property sales. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice trembling with remembered pain. "That was the worst experience of my family's life. These lawyers came to my door saying my husband had filed for bankruptcy before he died, saying I owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in business debts I'd never heard of. They had all these official papers, court documents. Everything looked legitimate." Mrs. Rodriguez explained that she had been overwhelmed by grief and intimidated by the legal complexity of the situation. The attorneys representing the bankruptcy court had convinced her that selling the strip mall was her only option to avoid personal liability for her husband's supposed business debts. "They said, if I didn't cooperate, I could lose my house too," she continued. "I trusted them because they seemed so professional, so knowledgeable about the law. But after everything was over, I found out my husband never filed for bankruptcy. Someone had forged his signature on documents filed after he was already dead. The implications were staggering. Marcus wasn't just hiding assets from me, he was systematically defrauding vulnerable property owners through fabricated legal proceedings. The $4.7 million in property holdings I had discovered weren't the result of savvy investing. They were the proceeds of an elaborate criminal enterprise. I spent the rest of Tuesday documenting every transaction I could find, creating a detailed timeline of Marcus's fraudulent activities. The more I investigated, the more victims I uncovered. Elderly property owners forced into fake bankruptcy proceedings. Small business owners convinced to sell their buildings to avoid manufactured legal problems. Immigrant families intimidated by complex English language documents they couldn't fully understand. Each case followed the same pattern. Marcus would identify vulnerable targets through his legitimate real estate business, then deploy a network of corrupt attorneys and fake court officials to create bogus legal crises that forced property sales at below-market prices. The shell companies would purchase the properties, then Marcus would either operate them for rental income or flip them for massive profit. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced the dates of these fraudulent transactions with Marcus's business trips over the past 3 years. Every time he had traveled for what he claimed were legitimate business deals, he had actually been orchestrating these property thefts in different cities throughout the state. The trip to Atlanta, where he was supposedly negotiating a commercial property deal, coincided with the fraudulent bankruptcy sale of a small office building owned by a recently divorced teacher. The Charlotte business trip had covered his acquisition of a retail center from an elderly man whose family was convinced he had dementia and couldn't manage his affairs. Marcus had been using our marriage as the perfect cover for his criminal activity. While I provided him with social credibility and professional respectability, he had been systematically destroying families and stealing their life savings. By Wednesday morning, I had documented evidence of at least 12 fraudulent property acquisitions worth over $4, but I also discovered something that made my blood run cold. According to his travel calendar and recent bank transfers, Marcus was planning to liquidate several of these properties within the next 2 weeks. He wasn't just planning to divorce me and move in with Natasha. He was planning to cash out his criminal enterprise and disappear with millions of dollars in stolen assets. I found evidence of this exit strategy in his computer files, hidden behind password protection, that took me 3 hours to crack using combinations of his birthday, our anniversary, and finally, Isabella's birthday. The folder labeled Phase 2 Implementation contained detailed plans for selling his entire property portfolio and transferring the proceeds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Marcus had already established foreign bank accounts under the name Mitchell Holdings International and had been gradually moving money out of the country for the past 6 months. The timeline for completing these transfers was aggressive. All properties sold and all money moved offshore within 30 days. The divorce wasn't just about ending our marriage, It was about eliminating the last witness to his legitimate identity before he disappeared entirely. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his planning. He had assumed that his homemaker wife would be too financially naive and emotionally devastated to investigate his affairs beyond the obvious betrayal. He had calculated that I would be so focused on his relationship with Natasha that I wouldn't think to examine the source of the wealth he was flaunting. Instead, he had inadvertently revealed his criminal activities to someone with exactly the legal expertise needed to understand and document financial fraud. Every fraudulent transaction he had conducted over the past 3 years was now evidence in what I was building into a comprehensive criminal case. I spent Wednesday afternoon consulting with my former law school roommate, Jennifer Walsh, who now worked as a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. I couldn't tell her everything over the phone, but I described a hypothetical case involving real estate fraud and bankruptcy manipulation. "What you're describing sounds like organized criminal activity," Jennifer said after I outlined the pattern of fraudulent transactions. "If someone was systematically using fake bankruptcy proceedings to steal properties, we'd be looking at federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and potentially RICO violations if there's an ongoing criminal enterprise." RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, designed to prosecute ongoing criminal conspiracies. If I could prove that Marcus had been operating a criminal enterprise through his network of shell companies and corrupt intermediaries, he could face decades in federal prison. Hypothetically, I continued, what would be the best way to document this kind of fraud for prosecution? Detailed financial records showing the pattern of transactions, victim statements demonstrating the fraudulent legal proceedings, and evidence of the conspiracy between the perpetrator and intermediaries, Jennifer replied. The key would be proving intent to defraud and showing that the bankruptcy proceedings were deliberately fabricated. I already had most of that evidence. What I needed now was proof of Marcus's coordination with the corrupt attorneys and court officials who had facilitated these crimes. That evidence came from an unexpected source. While searching through Marcus's email archives, I discovered that he had been remarkably careless about digital security. His business email account used the same password as his personal accounts, and he had been conducting criminal business through easily traceable electronic communications. The email exchanges were damning beyond anything I had hoped to find. Marcus had been coordinating with a network of at least 6 accomplices, including 2 attorneys who specialized in bankruptcy law, a court clerk who processed fraudulent paperwork, and several individuals who posed as creditors to create fake debt claims against target property. One email chain from 8 months ago laid out their entire operation in explicit detail. Marcus would identify vulnerable property owners through his legitimate real estate business. Attorney David Kim would then file fraudulent bankruptcy petitions using forged signatures and fabricated debt records. Court clerk Patricia Wells would fast-track these cases through the system without proper oversight. The fake creditors would submit inflated claims that made the properties appear worthless. Finally, Marcus's shell companies would purchase the properties at bankruptcy auctions, where they were often the only bidder. The emails contained specific instructions for forging documents, strategies for intimidating property owners into compliance, and detailed financial records showing how the stolen profits were divided among the conspirators. But the most valuable discovery was a recent email exchange between Marcus and David Kim, discussing their exit strategy. Marcus was planning to frame me as a co-conspirator in his crimes, claiming that I had helped him establish the shell companies and had been aware of the fraudulent transactions throughout our marriage. The wife angle gives us plausible deniability, Marcus had written. If anyone investigates, we can claim she was the mastermind and I was just following her legal advice. She's been out of practice for 2 years, so she can't effectively defend herself against sophisticated financial fraud charges. David Kim had responded with enthusiasm for this plan, noting that prosecutors often looked for fall guys in complex financial cases, and that a disgraced attorney made a perfect scapegoat. Reading these exchanges, I felt a cold fury unlike anything I had ever experienced. Marcus hadn't just betrayed our marriage and stolen millions of dollars from innocent victims. He had been planning to destroy my life completely, sending me to federal prison for crimes I had never committed while he lived comfortably in exile with Natasha and their child. The email evidence also revealed the full scope of their criminal network. Marcus wasn't working alone. He was part of a sophisticated organized crime operation that had been stealing properties throughout the Southeast for over 3 years. The network included corrupt court officials in 4 different states, a money laundering operation run through a chain of legitimate businesses, and connections to international financial crime. Most importantly, the emails contained detailed information about properties they were planning to steal in the coming months. Marcus's criminal enterprise wasn't winding down. It was expanding. The divorce and disappearance plan was just phase 2 of a much larger operation that would continue destroying families long after Marcus had vanished with his stolen million. I printed every email, photographed every document, and created multiple backup copies of all evidence on encrypted drives. By Thursday morning, when Marcus was scheduled to return from his Tampa trip, I had assembled a criminal case file that would have impressed any federal prosecutor. But I also made another discovery that changed everything about my approach to the situation. Hidden in Marcus's desk, behind a loose panel I had initially missed, I found a thick folder labeled Insurance Policies, Life and Property. The contents made me sick to my stomach. Marcus had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me 18 months ago, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The policy was worth $2.3 million and contained a double indemnity clause that would pay $4.6 million if my death was ruled accidental. Attached to the insurance documents was a handwritten note in Marcus's writing: Sarah accident, hiking trail, car accident, or home invasion. Timing after divorce filed but before finalized. Establish emotional instability, financial desperation, possible suicide risk. My husband wasn't just planning to frame me for his crimes, he was planning to kill me and collect millions in life insurance money, while eliminating the only person who could expose his criminal activities. The note contained additional details that made clear this wasn't a vague fantasy but a carefully considered plan. Marcus had researched hiking trails where accidents frequently occurred, studied traffic patterns on dangerous rural roads, and even investigated home invasion statistics in our neighborhood. Most chilling was a timeline he had sketched out. Divorce proceedings would establish my emotional instability and financial desperation, creating a believable motive for suicide. My death would occur after the divorce was filed but before it was finalized, ensuring that Marcus would inherit everything as my legal next of kin, while also collecting the insurance payout. Natasha and the baby weren't just Marcus's new family, they were his alibi. While I was being murdered, Marcus would be establishing his public presence with his girlfriend and child, creating witness testimony that would protect him from suspicion. I sat in his office, holding evidence of my planned murder, and realized that I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than marital infidelity or even financial fraud. Marcus was a sociopathic criminal who saw human beings as obstacles to be eliminated when they became inconvenient. The woman he had dismissed as an ordinary homemaker was now the only person who could stop him from destroying countless more lives. But I was also his primary target, marked for elimination in a plan he had been developing for over a year. When Marcus's Mercedes pulled into our driveway Thursday evening, I was ready for him, not as the devastated wife he expected to find, but as an attorney who had just uncovered one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises I had ever encountered. He walked through our front door carrying flowers and wearing the confident smile of a man who believed he controlled every variable in his life. He had no idea that his ordinary wife had just spent 3 days documenting enough evidence to send him and his entire criminal network to federal prison for life. Sarah, he said, extending the flowers with practiced charm, I brought these as a peace offering. I know this situation is difficult, but I hope we can work together to make the transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. I accepted the flowers with a smile that matched his own. Of course, Marcus, I've had some time to think about everything and I want to discuss our options. He looked relieved, clearly expecting that I had accepted the inevitable and was ready to cooperate with his plans. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, he said, settling into his favorite chair in our living room. I've been talking with my attorney about the best way to handle the asset division. Given the complexity of my business holdings, it might take a few weeks to get everything properly evaluated and divided. A few weeks. Exactly the timeline he needed to liquidate his stolen properties and transfer the money offshore before murdering me and disappearing forever. That sounds very sensible, I replied, sitting across from him and studying the face of the man who had planned to kill me. I'm curious about something though. How exactly did you accumulate enough assets to afford a house in Riverside Hills? I've been looking at our financial records, and I can't quite understand how the numbers work. For just a moment, Marcus's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. He hadn't expected me to ask detailed financial questions. It's complicated, he said carefully. Most of my wealth is tied up in business investments that aren't reflected in our personal accounts, property holdings, partnerships, things that generate income but aren't liquid assets. Property holdings, I repeated thoughtfully. That makes sense. What properties do you own personally, separate from Coastal Property Solutions? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched Marcus calculate how much he could safely reveal without exposing his criminal activity. A few commercial properties I've acquired as investments, he said finally. Nothing too exciting, just strip malls and small office buildings that generate rental income. That's fascinating, I said, maintaining my interested but naive tone. I'd love to understand more about how that works. For instance, how do you typically identify undervalued properties? Do you work with bankruptcy attorneys to find distressed sales? This time, Marcus's face went completely still. My question had been too specific, too knowledgeable for a homemaker who supposedly knew nothing about his business activities. Sarah, he said slowly, why are you asking these questions? I smiled at him with the same sweet expression I had perfected during 4 years of playing the supportive wife. I'm just trying to understand the financial situation before we proceed with the divorce, I said innocently. After all, if you own millions of dollars in property assets, that could significantly affect how we divide our marital estate. The word millions hit him like a physical blow. I watched the calculation in his eyes as he realized that I knew far more than I was supposed to know. I think you're overestimating the value of my holdings, he said carefully. Most of these properties aren't worth as much as they might appear on paper. Really? I tilted my head with genuine curiosity because I was looking at some public records, and it seems like Mountain View Holdings LLC owns some very valuable properties. The strip mall in Clearwater, for instance, appears to generate substantial rental income. Marcus went very pale. Mountain View Holdings was one of his shell companies, and the Clearwater strip mall was the property he had stolen from Mrs. Rodriguez through fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings. How do you know about Mountain View Holdings? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Oh, I found some papers in your office, I replied cheerfully. I hope you don't mind that I was curious about our finances. As your wife, I think I have a right to understand our economic situation, don't you? The mask of charming reasonableness finally slipped completely from Marcus's face. What remained was cold, calculating, and dangerous. What exactly do you think you know, Sarah? He asked, his tone now openly threatening. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at our peaceful suburban neighborhood where other couples were probably having normal conversations about their days, their children, their weekend plans. I know about the fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings, I said without turning around. I know about Mrs. Rodriguez and the Clearwater strip mall. I know about the forged documents and the fake creditors. I know about David Kim and Patricia Wells and your entire criminal network. I turned back to face him, no longer bothering to hide my own transformation from naive wife to dangerous adversary. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know about your plan to liquidate everything and disappear. And Marcus, I paused to let the next words sink in completely. I know about the life insurance policy and your plans for my unfortunate accident. The silence in our living room was absolute. Marcus stared at me with the expression of a predator who had suddenly discovered that his prey had teeth and claws and the knowledge to use them effectively. You've been busy, he said finally. I used to be a very good attorney, I replied. Apparently I still am. Marcus stood up slowly, and for the first time since I had known him,
I saw him as he really was. Not the charming businessman or the confident entrepreneur, but a cold-blooded criminal who had killed before and would kill again to protect his secrets. "So what happens now, Sarah?" he asked. "What exactly do you think you're going to do with this information?" I smiled at him one last time, the smile of a woman who held all the cards in a game he thought he had been controlling. "I'm going to destroy you, Marcus, completely and permanently. You wanted to know what your ordinary wife was capable of when you pushed her too far." The war had officially begun, and Marcus was about to discover that he had underestimated his opponent in every possible way. The silence that followed my revelation stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with the tension of everything that had just been exposed. Marcus stood frozen in our living room, his face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and something approaching genuine fear. For the first time in our marriage, I was watching him struggle to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his management. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but his voice lacked the confidence that had always been his trademark. "You couldn't have uncovered all of that in just 3 days." I walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a thick folder I had prepared specifically for this moment. The weight of it in my hands represented hundreds of hours of investigation, compressed into 3 days of focused legal work that had reminded me exactly who I used to be before I became his wife. "Would you like to see the evidence?" I asked, setting the folder on our coffee table. "I have bank records showing transfers through Mountain View Holdings, Sunset Properties, and 4 other shell companies. I have the forged bankruptcy documents with your signature specimens for comparison. I have email exchanges between you and David Kim, discussing specific fraud technique." Marcus's face had gone gray, but he still maintained his defensive posture. "Even if you have some financial records, that doesn't prove anything criminal. Property investment involves complex transactions that might look irregular to someone without business experience." "You're right," I said, opening the folder to a specific section. "Property investment can be complex, but this isn't property investment, Marcus. This is organized theft. For instance, here's the email where you instructed David Kim to forge Mr. Robert Chen's signature on bankruptcy documents, filed 3 weeks after Mr. Chen died of a heart attack." I pulled out a printed email and began reading aloud. "David, the Chen estate is perfect for our next acquisition. The old man died suddenly, widow doesn't speak much English, and the property is worth at least $800K. File the bankruptcy petition using the signature samples from the construction contract.
Make sure the debt claims are high enough to force immediate liquidation." Marcus lunged forward and grabbed the paper from my hands, staring at words he had written but apparently never expected to see again. "How did you access my email?" he demanded. "You used Isabella's birth date as your password," I replied calmly. "For someone running a criminal enterprise, you have remarkably poor digital security." That detail seemed to hit him harder than anything else I had revealed. The fact that I had cracked his password using his daughter's birth date was a betrayal of the intimacy he thought he controlled, a violation of the secrets he believed were safe. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a tone I had never heard before, soft and dangerous, "you need to be very careful about what you do with this information. You're playing with things you don't understand, involving people who don't appreciate interference." The threat was barely veiled, but I had been expecting it. Marcus's criminal network couldn't function if witnesses were allowed to expose their activities. I was no longer just his inconvenient wife. I was a threat to a multi-million-dollar operation that involved dangerous people. "Are you threatening me, Marcus?" I asked, maintaining my calm tone while my heart raced with the adrenaline of genuine danger. "I'm explaining reality," he replied. "The people I work with have significant investments in maintaining confidentiality. If you try to expose our business arrangements, you'll be putting yourself in a very dangerous position. More dangerous than the position I'm already in." I pulled out another document from my folder because, according to this life insurance policy, I'm already scheduled for an unfortunate accident sometime in the next few weeks. Marcus's face went completely white as he recognized the insurance documents he thought were safely hidden in his office. The handwritten notes about hiking trail accidents and home invasions were in his own writing. impossible to deny or explain away as anything other than murder plans. You went through my private papers, he said, but the accusation sounded hollow even to him. I went through the papers of a man who was planning to kill me, I corrected. That changes the rules somewhat, don't you think? For the first time since our confrontation began, Marcus seemed to deflate slightly. The mask of control he had worn throughout our marriage was finally cracking, revealing something desperate and cornered underneath. Sarah, you don't understand the situation you're in, he said, sitting down heavily in his chair. This isn't just about our marriage or even about money. The people I work with, the network I'm part of, they don't tolerate exposure. If you try to go to the authorities, they'll eliminate the threat before any investigation can proceed. You mean they'll kill me? I said flatly. I mean they'll protect their interests. Marcus replied, just like any business would protect itself from someone trying to destroy years of careful planning. The casual way he discussed my potential murder was perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire conversation. Marcus wasn't just a cheating husband or even a financial criminal. He was someone who could calmly discuss ending my life as if it were a routine business decision. But I had prepared for this possibility too. My 3 days of investigation had included more than just gathering evidence. I had been developing a strategy for survival that went far beyond simply exposing Marcus's crime. Marcus, I said, settling back into my chair with renewed confidence, I think you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about my situation. You seem to believe that I'm a desperate wife who stumbled across information she doesn't know how to use. You're wrong. I pulled out my phone and showed him a text message I had sent an hour before his arrival. I've already shared copies of all evidence with 3 different people. My sister Emma has complete files stored in a safety deposit box with instructions to deliver them to federal authorities if anything happens to me. My former law school roommate Jennifer Walsh, who is now a federal prosecutor, has reviewed the evidence and confirmed it meets the standards for RICO prosecution. And my old mentor Professor David Reynolds has copies stored with his estate attorney. Marcus stared at the phone screen, reading the confirmation messages from each of these people. His face was a mixture of rage and something approaching panic. But more importantly, I continued, I've already initiated contact with the Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Financial Crimes Division is expecting to hear from me tomorrow morning. If I don't check in as scheduled, she has instructions to begin immediate investigation based on the preliminary evidence I've already provided. The lie came smoothly, delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent years presenting arguments in legal proceedings. I hadn't actually contacted the FBI yet, but Marcus had no way to verify that information, and the threat of immediate federal involvement would force him to recalculate his options. You're bluffing, Marcus said again, but his voice was weaker this time. Test me. I replied simply, kill me tonight and see if federal agents show up at your door tomorrow afternoon. Marcus stood up and began pacing, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration I had rarely seen during our marriage. For the first time, he was truly trapped, caught between the criminal network that would eliminate him if he became a liability, and the federal prosecution that awaited if my evidence reached the authorities. What do you want? He asked finally. The question I had been waiting for. Marcus was finally ready to negotiate, which meant I could begin implementing the real plan I had developed during my 3 days of preparation. I want everything, I said simply. Complete financial disclosure of all assets, legitimate and stolen, full cooperation in returning properties to their rightful owners. And I want Natasha and Isabella protected from whatever consequences follow when your criminal network discovers you've been compromised. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at me. You want to protect Natasha? I want to protect an innocent baby and a woman who may not fully understand what she's gotten involved with, I clarified. Natasha made terrible choices, but Isabella doesn't deserve to suffer because her father is a criminal and her mother is naive. The offer seemed to confuse Marcus more than anything else I had said. He had expected anger, revenge, demands for financial compensation. He hadn't expected mercy for the woman who had destroyed our marriage. Sarah, even if I wanted to cooperate, the people I work with won't just let me walk away. This network has been operating for years. They have too much invested to allow exposure. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, I replied. Because Marcus, you're going to help me destroy this entire operation from the inside. The plan I outlined over the next hour was more complex and dangerous than anything I had ever attempted. But it was also the only strategy that offered a realistic chance of survival for everyone involved except the criminals who deserved to face justice. Marcus would continue operating normally for exactly 1 week, during which time I would gather additional evidence about the full scope of the criminal network. He would provide me with access to all communication channels, financial records, and operational details of their fraud system. Most importantly, he would help me identify every victim of their crimes so that restitution could be arranged. During this same week, Marcus would begin the delicate process of extracting Natasha and Isabella from any potential danger. He would convince Natasha that they needed to relocate temporarily for business reasons, moving them to a safe location where they would be protected when the criminal network inevitably collapsed. At the end of the week, Marcus would surrender himself to federal authorities along with complete evidence of the criminal enterprise. In exchange for his cooperation in prosecuting the other members of the network, he would plea bargain for a reduced sentence that would still involve significant prison time but wouldn't result in life imprisonment. "You're asking me to destroy my own life," Marcus said when I finished explaining the plan. "I'm offering you a chance to save your life," I corrected. "Because Marcus, your criminal associates are going to kill you anyway once they realize you've become a liability. At least this way, Isabella gets to know her father eventually instead of wondering what happened to the man who disappeared when she was 3 months old." The mention of his daughter seemed to break through Marcus's defenses in a way that threats and evidence had. For the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine emotion cross his face as he considered what his criminal lifestyle meant for his child's future. "And what about you?" he asked quietly. "What do you get out of this arrangement?" "I get to survive," I said simply. "I get to see justice for the families you've destroyed. And I get to rebuild my life without looking over my shoulder for the rest of my existence." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out our window at the suburban neighborhood where we had pretended to be a normal married couple while he orchestrated crimes that destroyed other families' lives. "How do I know you won't just turn me in immediately once you have everything you need?" he asked finally. "Because unlike you, I keep my word," I replied. "If you cooperate fully, provide complete evidence, and help protect the innocent people who got caught up in your crimes, I'll honor the plea arrangement. If you try to deceive me or put anyone in danger, I'll make sure you get the maximum possible sentence for every crime you've committed." The choice was clear, and we both knew it. Marcus could cooperate and hope for eventual freedom, or he could fight and face either federal prosecution or elimination by his own criminal associates. "I need guarantees," he said finally. "Protection for Natasha and Isabella, assurance that they won't face charges as accomplices, and confirmation that my cooperation will result in a reasonable plea agreement. Natasha won't face charges if she cooperates and testifies honestly about any knowledge she has," I assured him. "Isabella is an infant. She's not legally responsible for anything. And your plea agreement will depend on the value of your cooperation. But I'll recommend the minimum possible sentence consistent with justice for your victim." Marcus sat down again, the weight of his situation finally settling over him completely. The confident businessman who had dismissed me as ordinary was now dependent on my legal expertise and ethical judgment for his survival and that of his family. "There's something else you need to know," he said reluctantly. "About the network, about how deep this goes. The property fraud is just one part of a much larger operation. Money laundering, tax evasion, political corruption. It connects to things you haven't discovered yet." This revelation didn't surprise me. Complex criminal enterprises rarely limited themselves to single types of illegal activity, but it did confirm that dismantling Marcus's network would require federal resources beyond what I could provide alone. "Tell me everything," I said, pulling out a legal pad to begin documenting his confession. What Marcus revealed over the next 3 hours was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The property fraud operation was just the foundation for a criminal enterprise that included laundering money for drug cartels, facilitating tax evasion for corrupt politicians, and providing financial services for organized crime families throughout the Southeast. David Kim, the bankruptcy attorney I had already identified, was actually running legal services for multiple criminal organizations. Patricia Wells, the court clerk, was part of a network of corrupted court officials who facilitated everything from fraudulent property sales to manipulated criminal cases. But the most disturbing revelation was the identity of the person at the top of this criminal hierarchy. Marcus's ultimate boss wasn't another businessman or even a traditional organized crime figure. It was Judge William Harrison, a respected federal judge who had been using his position to orchestrate criminal activities for over a decade. Judge Harrison controlled a network of corrupt court officials, attorneys, and business people who generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal professionals. Marcus's property fraud was just one division of an enterprise that included judicial corruption, legal malpractice, and systematic obstruction of justice. Harrison is the one who recruited me, Marcus explained. He approached me 3 years ago when I was struggling financially, offered to help me acquire properties through special legal arrangements. I thought it was legitimate business networking until I was already too deep to get out. The implications were terrifying. A corrupt federal judge had enough power to manipulate legal proceedings, suppress investigations, and eliminate threats through official channels. If Judge Harrison discovered that Marcus had been compromised, he could use his judicial authority to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and ensure that no prosecution could succeed. Marcus, I said carefully, how much does Judge Harrison know about your personal life, about me? He knows everything, Marcus replied grimly. Harrison maintains detailed files on everyone in the network, including family members. He considers personal information a form of insurance, leverage to ensure loyalty and silence, which meant that Judge Harrison already knew I existed, knew my background as an attorney, and would consider me a potential threat to his criminal empire. My plan to cooperate with federal authorities had just become exponentially more dangerous, but there might be a way to use that against him, Marcus continued. Harrison's paranoia about maintaining files on everyone means he's created documentation of his own criminal activities. If we could access his personal records, we'd have evidence of the entire network. Where does he keep these records? His private office at his estate in Bell Harbor. Harrison hosts monthly meetings there for the senior members of the network. The next meeting is scheduled for this Saturday. An idea began forming in my mind. Dangerous but potentially decisive. If I could access Judge Harrison's files during the Saturday meeting, I could gather evidence of the entire criminal network while everyone was conveniently gathered in one location. Marcus, how many people attend these meetings? Usually about 8. Harrison, David Kim, Patricia Wells, 3 other attorneys who handle different aspects of the operation, a money laundering specialist, and me, and they're all in Harrison's house at the same time, for about 3 hours every month. Harrison serves dinner and conducts business in his private study. It's very formal, very controlled. The opportunity was perfect, but the risk was enormous. If I was discovered attempting to steal evidence from a federal judge's private residence while he was hosting a meeting of his criminal associates, there would be no legal protection or federal backup to save me. But it was also the only chance to gather evidence comprehensive enough to bring down the entire network before they realized Marcus had been compromised. I'm going to that meeting, I said finally. Marcus stared at me in horror. Sarah, you can't be serious. These people are dangerous criminals. If they catch you in Harrison's house, they'll kill you without hesitation. Then we'll have to make sure they don't catch me, I replied. You're going to help me plan an infiltration that gets me access to those files while providing cover for your continued cooperation. The plan we developed over the rest of the evening was audacious in its complexity and terrifying in its potential consequences. Marcus would attend the Saturday meeting as usual, providing me with detailed information about the layout of Harrison's estate, the timing of dinner service, and the security measures I would need to circumvent. While the criminals conducted their monthly business meeting, I would be searching Harrison's private files for evidence of the entire network's operation. Marcus would help by creating distractions during dinner, extending conversations to keep everyone occupied, and providing signals about when it was safe for me to move through the house. The risks were enormous, but so were the potential reward. If successful,
I would have evidence to prosecute not just Marcus's property fraud scheme, but an entire criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as we finalized our plan. "If this goes wrong, if something happens to you during the infiltration, what happens to Natasha and Isabella?" It was the first time he had asked about their welfare without any self-interest involved, and I realized that despite everything he had done, Marcus did genuinely care about his daughter's future. "If something happens to me, my sister Emma has instructions to contact federal authorities with all the evidence we've gathered," I assured him. "Natasha and Isabella will be protected as witnesses, and you'll still have the opportunity to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. And if the plan succeeds, then we bring down Judge Harrison's entire network, return stolen property to its rightful owners, and ensure that Isabella grows up knowing her father made the right choice when it mattered most." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of our agreement settling over both of us. In less than 48 hours, I would be infiltrating the home of a corrupt federal judge while he hosted a meeting of dangerous criminals, risking everything on a plan that could either expose a massive criminal conspiracy or get me killed. But for the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, I felt like I was back in control of my own destiny. The ordinary housewife he had dismissed was about to attempt something that would either establish her as one of the most effective amateur investigators in criminal justice history, or ensure that she became another victim of the system she was trying to expose. Either way, Marcus was about to learn exactly what his wife was capable of when she stopped playing by his rules and started making her own. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for early spring, the kind of perfect weather that made Judge Harrison's Bell Harbor estate look like something from a magazine spread. I sat in my car 3 blocks away watching the sun set behind the manicured trees that surrounded the property, and tried to control the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Marcus had left for the meeting an hour earlier carrying a small recording device hidden in his jacket pocket and a detailed list of questions designed to keep the other criminals talking while I searched Harrison's file. We had rehearsed every aspect of the plan, but sitting alone in the growing darkness, I felt the full weight of what I was about to attempt. The estate was surrounded by an 8-foot privacy fence, but Marcus had identified a section near the back garden where landscaping provided cover for scaling the barrier. Security cameras covered the main entrances, but Harrison's arrogance had left blind spots that could be exploited by someone who knew exactly where to look. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dinner starting now. Kitchen staff will be occupied for next 90 minutes. Study is clear." I took a deep breath, checked my equipment one final time, and began walking toward the estate. The small backpack I carried contained lockpicks, a portable scanner for photographing documents, and a burner phone programmed with emergency contact. If everything went wrong, I had exactly 3 people who knew where I was and would contact authorities if I didn't check in by midnight. The fence was easier to climb than I had anticipated. Years of yoga and tennis had kept me in better physical condition than I realized, and within minutes I was crouched in Harrison's perfectly maintained garden, listening for any signs that my entry had been detected. The house loomed above me, a colonial mansion that spoke of old money and established power. Light poured from the dining room windows on the first floor, and I could hear the faint sound of conversation and laughter. Marcus was in there now, playing his role as loyal criminal associate while 8 dangerous people discussed their illegal activities over expensive wine and gourmet food. Harrison's study was located on the 2nd floor, in a room that overlooked the garden where I was hiding. Marcus had provided detailed information about the house's layout, including the location of the back staircase that the kitchen staff used, and that would allow me to reach the 2nd floor without passing through areas where the dinner guests might see me. The back door was protected by a sophisticated electronic lock, but my years of real estate law had included enough exposure to security systems that I understood the basic principles. More importantly, Marcus had provided the override code that Harrison used when he wanted to access the house without alerting his household staff. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and I slipped inside the darkened kitchen. The sound of dinner conversation was louder now, coming from the formal dining room at the front of the house. I could distinguish individual voices, including Marcus's measured tone as he asked questions about upcoming property acquisition. The back staircase was exactly where Marcus had described it, a narrow service passage that allowed staff to move between floors without disturbing the main areas of the house. I climbed slowly, testing each step for creaks that might betray my presence to the criminals dining below. Harrison's study was a testament to his position and personality. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with legal texts, case law, and what appeared to be first-edition classics. The 4th wall featured a massive desk, executive chairs, and a wall safe that was partially concealed behind a painting of a Supreme Court justice. But it was the filing cabinets that interested me most. Marcus had explained that Harrison maintained physical files on every aspect of his criminal network, believing that digital records were too vulnerable to hacking or subpoena. His paranoia about electronic surveillance had led him to keep detailed paper records of everything from financial transactions to personal information about network members. The filing cabinets were locked, but the picks I had brought made quick work of the simple mechanism. Harrison's confidence in his home security had made him careless about securing individual pieces of furniture. The first drawer I opened contained financial records that took my breath away. Bank statements showing millions of dollars flowing through dozens of accounts, property deeds for stolen real estate worth over $15 million, and detailed accounting of profits distributed among network members. But it was the second drawer that contained the evidence I had really come for. Harrison maintained individual files on every person in his criminal network, complete with personal information, family details, criminal activities, and what he termed leverage points for ensuring loyalty. Marcus's file was thick, containing not only records of his property fraud activities, but photographs of our house, copies of my law school transcripts, and detailed financial information about both of us. Harrison had been monitoring our marriage for years, documenting everything that could be used to control or eliminate Marcus if necessary. More disturbing were the files on other network members. David Kim's folder contained photographs of his teenage daughter and information about her college plans. Patricia Wells's file included medical records, suggesting she was being blackmailed over a prescription drug addiction. Every person in Harrison's network was being systematically controlled through fear and intimidation. I photographed every document as quickly as possible, the portable scanner capturing page after page of evidence that would destroy Harrison's criminal empire. Financial records, property deeds, correspondence with other criminal organizations, and detailed plans for future illegal activities. The most damning evidence was in a folder labeled Judicial Services. Harrison had been using his position as a federal judge to fix court cases, suppress investigations, and protect criminal associates. He had corrupted other judges, intimidated prosecutors, and manipulated legal proceedings for over a decade. But it was the final folder that made my hands shake as I photographed its contents. Termination records contained detailed information about people who had threatened Harrison's network, and the methods used to eliminate them. At least 8 people had been murdered over the past 5 years, their deaths carefully arranged to appear accidental or suicide. One name on the list made my blood freeze: Margaret Patterson, the elderly woman whose strip mall Marcus had stolen through fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings. According to Harrison's notes, Mrs. Patterson had become suspicious about the legitimacy of the legal proceedings, and had started asking questions. 3 weeks later, she had died in what was ruled a home invasion robbery. Harrison's network didn't just steal property, they murdered anyone who got too close to exposing their crimes. I was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that included systematic homicide to protect their illegal activity. My phone vibrated with another text from Marcus. Conversation getting heated about security concerns. Someone mentioned increased federal attention, may need to leave early. The message sent ice through my veins. If the criminals were discussing federal investigation, they might already know that their network had been compromised. I needed to finish photographing the evidence and get out of the house immediately. I moved to the final filing cabinet, hands shaking as I picked the lock and pulled open drawers filled with correspondence between Harrison and organized crime figures throughout the Southeast. Letters, emails, and financial records showing coordination between Harrison's network and major criminal organizations. But as I photographed the last of these documents, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps in the hallway outside the study. Someone was coming upstairs while the dinner was supposedly still in progress. I quickly closed the filing cabinets and looked for places to hide. The study had few options, but there was a large antique armoire in one corner that might provide concealment if someone was just checking the room casually. The door opened as I pressed myself into the back corner of the armoire, peering through a crack in the wooden door.
Judge William Harrison entered his study, moving with the confident stride of someone in his own territory. Harrison was exactly what I had expected from Marcus's descriptions: tall, distinguished, with silver hair, and the kind of authoritative presence that commanded respect in courtrooms. But seeing him in person, knowing what I now knew about his crimes, I saw the cold calculation behind his judicial demeanor. He moved directly to his desk and pulled out a cell phone, dialing a number with practiced efficiency. "It's Harrison," he said when the call connected. "We have a problem. David Kim just received information that suggests federal agents have been asking questions about bankruptcy proceedings in Clearwater County." My heart pounded as I listened to Harrison discuss the investigation that I had helped trigger. The FBI contact I had claimed to Marcus was apparently becoming reality, though I had no idea how. "I want enhanced surveillance on all network members immediately," Harrison continued. "If there's been a security breach, I need to know who's responsible and how much they've revealed." Harrison paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the call. "No, we can't afford to wait for more information. If federal agents are investigating our bankruptcy operations, they're already too close. Implement termination protocols for anyone who might have provided information." Termination protocols. The clinical language Harrison used to discuss murder made clear that my life, Marcus's life, and potentially Natasha and Isabella's lives were now in immediate danger. "Start with the Mitchell property," Harrison said, and my blood turned to ice. "Marcus has access to too much information, and his personal situation makes him vulnerable to pressure. His wife used to be an attorney. She might be smart enough to piece things together." The judge continued giving instructions about eliminating threats to his network while I crouched in his armoire, documenting his words on my phone's recording app. Harrison was ordering the murder of his own associates, including my husband, based on nothing more than the possibility that they might cooperate with authorities. "Make it look like a home invasion," Harrison instructed. "Multiple victims, robbery gone wrong. And make sure there are no survivors who might have information about our operations." The call ended, and Harrison returned to his desk, pulling out files and reviewing documents with the methodical approach of someone planning systematic murder. I watched him for another few minutes, gathering additional evidence of his criminal planning, before he finally left the study to return to his dinner guests. I waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before emerging from the armoire. The evidence I had gathered was more than sufficient to bring down Harrison's entire network, but the immediate threat to our lives meant I needed to change our plans dramatically. Instead of waiting for Marcus to complete his cooperation agreement, I needed to contact federal authorities immediately. Harrison was planning to eliminate everyone who posed a threat, which meant Marcus, Natasha, Isabella and I were all marked for death within hours or days. I made my way back downstairs and out of the house, retracing my entry route with desperate urgency. Once I was safely back in my car, I pulled out my real cell phone and dialed the number I had memorized for the FBI's emergency hotline. "This is FBI Emergency Services," answered a professional voice. "I need to report an immediate threat against federal witnesses and evidence of judicial corruption," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Ma'am, I'll connect you with the appropriate agent. Can you provide your name and location?" "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm currently outside the residence of Federal Judge William Harrison at 47 Bell Harbor Drive, where I've just gathered evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving murder, property fraud, and judicial corruption. Judge Harrison is currently planning to kill multiple people tonight to prevent federal investigation." The words sounded surreal coming out of my mouth, but they had the desired effect. Within seconds I was connected to Special Agent Patricia Morris from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to need you to explain very carefully what evidence you have and what immediate threats you're aware of," Agent Morris said. "Over the next 20 minutes, I provided Agent Morris with a comprehensive summary of everything I had discovered about Harrison's criminal network. I described the property fraud scheme, the systematic murder of witnesses, and the immediate threat to multiple lives. Most importantly, I transmitted digital copies of all the evidence I had photographed, including Harrison's termination protocols and his recorded conversation about eliminating network members. Ms. Mitchell, the evidence you've provided is substantial enough to justify immediate federal intervention, Agent Morris said. We're going to need you and your husband in federal protective custody within the next hour. How quickly can you contact him? He's currently in Judge Harrison's house, attending a dinner meeting with the other members of the criminal network, I explained. He's there as part of our plan to gather evidence, but he doesn't know that Harrison has ordered our termination. Ma'am, your husband is in immediate danger. We need to extract him from that location immediately. Agent Morris coordinated with local FBI units, while I drove back toward Harrison's estate. Within 30 minutes, federal agents were surrounding the property, preparing to arrest everyone at the dinner meeting while ensuring Marcus's safety. I watched from a secure location as FBI agents executed coordinated arrests of Harrison's entire criminal network. Judge William Harrison, David Kim, Patricia Wells, and 5 other conspirators were taken into custody simultaneously, preventing any opportunity for them to destroy evidence or harm witnesses. Marcus emerged from the house in handcuffs, but Agent Morris had assured me that his restraints were purely for show until the situation was completely secure. He would be processed as a cooperating witness rather than a defendant, consistent with our cooperation agreement. The next few hours passed in a blur of federal interviews, evidence documentation, and coordination with prosecutors who would handle the massive criminal case we had uncovered. The evidence I had gathered from Harrison's study, combined with Marcus's recorded conversations and testimony, provided federal authorities with enough material to prosecute one of the most extensive judicial corruption cases in recent history. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Morris informed me that they had intercepted Harrison's hit team before they could reach our house. 3 armed men had been arrested while conducting surveillance of our neighborhood, carrying weapons and detailed plans for staging our murders as a home invasion robbery. Marcus and I spent the next week in federal protective custody while prosecutors built their cases against Harrison's network. During those long conversations in safe house conference rooms, we finally had honest discussions about our marriage, his crimes, and what the future would hold for both of us. I'm sorry, Marcus said during one of our private conversations, not just for the affair or the criminal activities, but for making you feel like you had to give up your career to support mine. You were always the stronger one, the smarter one. I was just too insecure to admit it. The apology came too late to save our marriage, but it provided the closure I needed to move forward with my life. Marcus would serve 8 years in federal prison in exchange for his cooperation, but he would eventually be released to build a relationship with Isabella and attempt to make amends for the damage he had caused. Natasha, as I had suspected, had been largely ignorant of Marcus's criminal activities. She cooperated fully with federal investigators and was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. More importantly, she agreed to allow Marcus's family to help support Isabella financially while he served his sentence. The property restitution process took 18 months, but every stolen property was eventually returned to its rightful owners or their families. Miss Rodriguez got her strip mall back, along with compensation for the years of lost rental income. The Chen family recovered their father's office building and learned the truth about the fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings that had victimized them. Judge Harrison received a life sentence without possibility of parole for his role in multiple murders and decades of judicial corruption. His criminal network was completely dismantled, with sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years for various members. As for me, I discovered that surviving a life-threatening criminal conspiracy had given me a new perspective on what I wanted to do with my legal career. I opened a practice specializing in helping victims of financial fraud recover stolen assets and prosecute white-collar criminals. My first major case involved representing families victimized by a property investment scam remarkably similar to Marcus's operation. Using the investigative techniques I had developed during my own ordeal, I was able to help recover over $3 million in stolen assets and send 4 more criminals to federal prison. The brass nameplate on my office door reads, Sarah Mitchell, Attorney at Law, Financial Crimes Recovery, and every day it reminds me that the woman Marcus dismissed as ordinary had been capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. 6 months after Harrison's sentencing, I received an unexpected visitor. Natasha Coleman arrived at my office carrying Isabella, now nearly a year old and beginning to walk. "I wanted to thank you," Natasha said simply. "Marcus told me what you did to protect us, how you could have let Harrison's people hurt us but chose to save us instead." I looked at Isabella, a beautiful child with Marcus's eyes and her mother's determination, and felt no anger toward either of them. They had been victims of Marcus's manipulation just as much as I had been. "What are your plans now?" I asked Natasha. "I'm starting nursing school in the fall," she replied. "Marcus set up a trust fund for Isabella's education, and his family is helping with childcare. I want to build a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's criminal activities." As they left my office, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed from that Tuesday morning when Natasha had called to tell me about her affair with my husband. The ordinary housewife who had received that devastating phone call had evolved into someone who could take down federal judges and criminal conspiracies. Marcus had been right about one thing: I deserved better than the life we had built together, but he had been wrong about everything else. I wasn't too ordinary for success. I had simply been applying my extraordinary abilities to supporting someone else's dreams, instead of pursuing my own. The mansion in Riverside Hills that Marcus and Natasha had planned to share was sold by federal authorities, with the proceeds going to victim compensation. I bought a smaller house in a neighborhood where children played in the streets, and neighbors actually knew each other's names. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, but it was mine, built with my own work and my own choices, and I had learned that sometimes ordinary was exactly what you needed to build something extraordinary. 2 years after Judge Harrison's conviction, I stood in the marble lobby of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta waiting for the elevator that would take me to the 23rd floor where the most important case of my legal career was about to conclude. The briefcase in my hand contained evidence that would either vindicate 18 months of investigation, or prove that I had been chasing shadows in my pursuit of what I believed was the largest financial conspiracy in southeastern legal history. The case had begun 6 months earlier when Maria Santos, a 67-year-old grandmother from Tampa, had walked into my office carrying a cardboard box filled with legal documents and a story that sounded impossible. Her late husband's construction company, which had been profitable for 30 years, had somehow accumulated millions of dollars in debt she had never heard of. Bankruptcy attorneys had appeared at her door within days of his funeral, claiming that creditors were demanding immediate payment of obligations that would force the sale of everything her family had built. "Miss Mitchell," Maria had said in heavily accented English, "these people, they have papers that show my Roberto owed money to companies I never heard of, but Roberto, he was so careful with money, he never borrowed from strangers, never made deals without telling me. Something is wrong, but I don't know how to prove it." The documents Maria brought were sophisticated forgeries, but my experience with Marcus's criminal network had taught me to recognize the patterns of systematic fraud. Roberto Santos had been dead for 3 weeks when bankruptcy petitions were filed in his name, claiming debts to shell companies that existed only on paper. The legal proceedings were being expedited through the same corrupt system that Harrison had controlled, but with new players who had stepped in to fill the vacuum left by his conviction. What made Maria's case extraordinary wasn't just the obvious fraud, but the scope of the criminal enterprise I uncovered during my investigation. Harrison's network hadn't been completely dismantled by his prosecution. Instead, it had evolved and expanded under new leadership, incorporating lessons learned from Harrison's downfall to create an even more sophisticated operation. The new network was run by federal judge Catherine Blackwood, Harrison's former law school roommate and longtime criminal associate who had managed to avoid prosecution during the original investigation. Judge Blackwood had been operating her own parallel criminal enterprise for years, coordinating with Harrison's network without being directly connected to his most visible activity. But what set Judge Blackwood apart from her predecessor was her understanding that the real money in judicial corruption came not from stealing individual properties, but from manipulating the entire legal system to generate systematic wealth extraction from vulnerable populations. Her network didn't just steal properties, they had created a pipeline that funneled billions of dollars from elderly estates, immigrant families and small businesses,
through fraudulent legal proceedings. The Santos case was just one victim in an operation that had processed over 300 fraudulent bankruptcy cases in the past 18 months. Each case followed the same pattern: target families in crisis, create false debt claims, expedite legal proceedings through corrupted courts, and strip assets through manipulated sales to shell companies. But Judge Blackwood had learned from Harrison's mistake. Instead of maintaining physical files that could be stolen, she had created a distributed digital network that was nearly impossible to infiltrate. Instead of relying on a small group of corrupt attorneys, she had recruited dozens of lawyers who handled individual pieces of cases without understanding the broader conspiracy. And instead of operating from a single location, she had spread her activities across 6 states and multiple federal jurisdictions. Breaking through this new network had required everything I had learned from my experience with Harrison's operation, plus investigative techniques I had developed specifically for complex digital financial crime. I had spent 8 months tracing shell companies through international banking systems, identifying patterns in case filings across multiple court systems, and building relationships with victims who were scattered across the Southeast. The breakthrough had come when I discovered that Judge Blackwood was using her position on the federal appeals court to manipulate cases that challenged the bankruptcy decisions made by her network of corrupt lower court judges. She wasn't just stealing money, she was systematically preventing victims from appealing fraudulent decisions by ensuring that appellate reviews were assigned to judges who would rubber stamp the lower court ruling. But proving this appellate manipulation required evidence that could only be obtained through federal investigation, with resources far beyond what my small practice could provide. I had spent 4 months building a relationship with FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, the same agent who had handled Harrison's case, convincing her that Blackwood's network represented a national security threat to the integrity of the federal court system. Agent Torres had initially been skeptical that a criminal network could have emerged so quickly after Harrison's conviction, but the evidence I provided had convinced her to authorize a complex undercover investigation. For 6 months, federal agents had been infiltrating Blackwood's network, documenting criminal activities and building cases against dozens of corrupt officials. The operation had culminated 3 days earlier with coordinated arrests across 6 states, including Judge Blackwood herself, who had been taken into custody in her chambers while presiding over a fraudulent bankruptcy case. But the most important arrest had been Anthony Rivera, a forensic accountant who had been providing expert testimony in hundreds of bankruptcy cases to support fraudulent debt claims. Dr. Rivera's cooperation with federal authorities had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to prove that Judge Blackwood's network had systematically defrauded over 2,000 families of more than $800 million. His detailed records showed how false debt claims were manufactured, how expert testimony was fabricated to support fraudulent legal proceedings, and how the profits were distributed among network members. Today's hearing was the culmination of that investigation. Judge Blackwood and 37 members of her criminal network were being sentenced simultaneously, in what prosecutors were calling the largest judicial corruption case in American history. But more importantly, for my clients, today was when the federal court would approve the restitution plan that would return stolen assets to victims and provide compensation for families whose losses couldn't be directly recovered. I had been asked to represent the Victim Impact Committee, speaking on behalf of over 400 families who had been defrauded by Blackwood's network. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on me, knowing that my words would be the last thing these criminals heard before beginning prison sentences that would likely last the rest of their lives. The elevator arrived, and I rode up to the 23rd floor in silence, reviewing the victim impact statement I would deliver in 30 minutes. The document in my hand represented thousands of hours of work by victims who had trusted me to tell their stories and demand justice for the systematic destruction of their family's financial security. The courtroom was packed with victims, federal agents, prosecutors, and media representatives, who had been following the case for months. Judge Patricia Williams, who had been specially appointed to handle the sentencing, had a reputation for thorough consideration of victim impact and appropriate punishment for white-collar criminals. Maria Santos sat in the front row, wearing the black dress she had worn to her husband's funeral 2 years earlier. Beside her sat dozens of other elderly victims, many of whom had lost their homes, their businesses, and their life savings to Blackwood's systematic theft. Behind them were the adult children of victims who had died before seeing justice, federal agents who had worked tirelessly to build these cases, and prosecutors who had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. Judge Blackwood sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, maintaining the dignified composure that had served her well during 30 years on the federal bench. But her judicial robes had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and the authority she had wielded to destroy families was now just a memory from her former life. When Judge Williams called for victim impact statements, I approached the podium with a mixture of professional confidence and personal conviction that I had never experienced before. The statement I was about to deliver wasn't just about legal justice, it was about the fundamental responsibility of the legal system to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust. Your Honor, I began, I appear today representing over 400 families, whose lives have been systematically destroyed by a criminal conspiracy that used the authority and prestige of our federal court system to steal nearly $1 billion from American families. I proceeded to detail the scope of Blackwood's crimes, describing how her network had targeted elderly widows, immigrant families, and small business owners, who trusted that legal documents and court proceedings represented legitimate authority. I explained how Maria Santos had nearly lost everything her husband had built over 30 years, because corrupt judges had expedited fraudulent legal proceedings without proper oversight. But the most powerful part of my statement focused on the broader implications of judicial corruption for public trust in legal institutions. When federal judges used their positions to steal from the very people they were sworn to protect, the entire foundation of legal authority was undermined, in ways that extended far beyond individual financial losses. Judge Blackwood and her associates didn't just steal money, I continued. They stole something far more valuable, the faith that ordinary Americans place in the idea that our legal system exists to protect them rather than exploit them. When a federal judge becomes a criminal, when court proceedings become tools for theft, when legal documents become instruments of fraud, the entire concept of justice under law is threatened. I spoke for 20 minutes, describing individual cases that illustrated the human cost of Blackwood's crimes: elderly couples who had lost their homes and been forced to move in with adult children, small business owners who had seen their life's work stolen through fabricated legal proceedings, immigrant families who had been intimidated by complex English language documents they couldn't understand, but trusted because they came from official court sources. But I also spoke about the broader pattern of corruption that extended beyond Blackwood's network. The investigation had revealed that judicial corruption was more widespread than anyone had previously understood, with similar criminal enterprises operating in multiple federal jurisdictions across the country. Your Honor, I concluded, the sentences you impose today will send a message about whether our legal system is capable of holding its own officials accountable when they betray the public trust. These defendants used their positions of authority to systematically steal from vulnerable families. They corrupted legal proceedings, fabricated evidence, and manipulated court systems that are supposed to protect the innocent. Their crimes demand punishment that reflects not just the financial harm they caused, but the institutional damage they inflicted on the integrity of federal justice. Judge Williams listened to victim impact statements for over 2 hours, hearing from families whose lives had been destroyed by Blackwood's systematic theft. Some victims spoke through tears about losing homes they had lived in for decades. Others described the humiliation of being forced to declare bankruptcy because of debts they had never incurred. Many spoke about losing faith in legal institutions they had previously trusted, without question. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Williams turned her attention to the defendants. Judge Blackwood was the first to be sentenced, and the proceedings that followed were unlike anything I had ever witnessed in a federal courtroom. Catherine Blackwood, Judge Williams began, you held one of the highest positions of trust in our legal system. For 30 years, you wore the robes of a federal judge, taking an oath to administer justice fairly and protect the constitutional rights of all Americans. Instead, you used that position to orchestrate one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the history of American jurisprudence. Judge Williams proceeded to detail the scope of Blackwood's crimes, describing how she had corrupted not just individual cases, but entire court systems. The evidence showed that Blackwood had manipulated appellate reviews of hundreds of cases, preventing victims from challenging fraudulent lower court decisions, and ensuring that her criminal network could operate without interference from legitimate judicial oversight. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates that you didn't just steal money, Judge Williams continued, you stole justice itself. You corrupted the very institution that Americans depend on to resolve disputes fairly and protect their rights. The damage you have caused extends far beyond the financial losses suffered by your direct victims. The sentence Judge Williams imposed was historic: life in prison without the possibility of parole plus forfeiture of all assets and $400 million in restitution. Judge Blackwood would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, and every asset she had accumulated during her criminal career would be liquidated to compensate victims. The other members of Blackwood's network received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with federal authorities. Rivera, whose cooperation had been essential to building the case, received a reduced sentence of 12 years, but was required to forfeit his professional credentials and pay $50 million in restitution. But the most significant outcome of the sentencing hearing wasn't the punishment imposed on individual criminals. Judge Williams used the occasion to announce the creation of a new federal task force dedicated to investigating judicial corruption and implementing reforms to prevent similar criminal enterprises from emerging in the future. The Judicial Integrity Task Force would include FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and independent investigators, with the authority to monitor court systems, investigate suspicious case patterns, and prosecute corrupt officials. More importantly, the task force would include victim advocates and private attorneys who could identify potential corruption and bring it to federal attention before it reached the scale of the Harrison and Blackwood network. As the hearing concluded and defendants were led away to begin their prison sentences, I felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond professional satisfaction. The ordinary housewife, who had discovered her husband's betrayal 3 years earlier, had evolved into someone capable of bringing down federal judges and criminal conspiracies that threatened the integrity of American legal institutions. But the most meaningful moment came after the formal proceedings ended, when Maria Santos approached me in the courthouse hallway. She was crying, but for the first time since I had met her, they were tears of relief rather than grief. "Miss Mitchell," she said, taking my hands in hers, "my Roberto would be so proud to know that people like you exist. He always believed that America was a place where justice was possible, even for people like us who don't have money or power. You proved he was right."
The restitution process took another 8 months, but by the end of that year, over $600 million in stolen assets had been returned to victims. Families who had lost their homes were able to reclaim them. Small businesses that had been destroyed by fraudulent legal proceedings were compensated for their losses. Elderly victims who had been forced into poverty by systematic theft received financial support that allowed them to maintain their dignity and independence. The impact of the Blackwood prosecution extended far beyond individual restitution. The federal reforms implemented as a result of the investigation had led to enhanced oversight of bankruptcy proceedings, improved protection for vulnerable populations, and new mechanisms for identifying and prosecuting judicial corruption. But perhaps the most important outcome was the restoration of faith in legal institutions among communities that had been systematically victimized by corrupt officials. When families like the Santos family saw that the legal system could hold its own officials accountable, they regained trust in courts, attorneys, and legal proceedings that had been shattered by their experiences with criminal judges. My practice had grown substantially as a result of the publicity surrounding the Blackwood case, but I had made a conscious decision to maintain focus on representing victims of financial crimes rather than expanding into more profitable areas of law. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it provided a sense of purpose that had been missing during my years as Marcus's wife. 6 months after Blackwood's sentencing, I received a letter that provided unexpected closure to my own personal journey. Marcus had written from federal prison, where he was serving his 8-year sentence for his role in Harrison's property fraud network. "Sarah," his letter began, "I've been reading about your work on the Blackwood case, and I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. Not proud as your former husband, but proud as someone who knows how extraordinary you've always been, even when I was too selfish and insecure to acknowledge it. Marcus went on to describe his life in prison, his relationship with Isabella, who visited him monthly with Natasha, and his plans for rebuilding his life when he was eventually released. But the most meaningful part of his letter was his acknowledgement of how thoroughly he had underestimated my capabilities, and his gratitude for my decision to protect Natasha and Isabella despite his betrayal. "You saved my daughter's life when you could have let Harrison's people kill all of us," he wrote. "Isabella will grow up knowing that there are people in the world who choose to do the right thing even when they've been hurt by others. That's a gift you gave her that I could never provide." The letter concluded with information I hadn't expected. Marcus had been working with federal authorities to identify other victims of property fraud, using his knowledge of criminal networks to help investigators find families who might not even realize they had been defrauded. His cooperation had led to the recovery of an additional $12 million in stolen assets and the prosecution of 3 more corrupt attorneys. Reading Marcus's letter, I realized that my decision to show mercy rather than seek revenge had created outcomes I could never have anticipated. By protecting Natasha and Isabella, I had ensured that a child would grow up with both parents eventually available to her, even if one of them had to serve time for his crime. By encouraging Marcus's cooperation rather than demanding maximum punishment, I had helped recover millions of dollars for other victims and expanded the investigation that led to Blackwood's prosecution. The woman who had been dismissed as ordinary had discovered that extraordinary outcomes were possible when you chose justice over vengeance, when you protected the innocent, even when they were connected to people who had hurt you, and when you used your skills to build something positive, rather than simply destroy what had been taken from you. Today, 5 years after that devastating phone call from Natasha, I run one of the most successful financial crimes practices in the South. My office walls are lined with letters from families whose lives have been restored through the recovery of stolen assets, photographs from community events where victims have been honored for their courage in pursuing justice, and awards from legal organizations that recognize the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from financial exploitation. But the most meaningful decoration in my office is a small framed photograph of Isabella, now 6 years old, at her kindergarten graduation. Natasha had sent the picture with a note explaining that Isabella had written a school report about brave people who help families, and had chosen to write about me rather than more traditional heroes like firefighters or police officers. According to Natasha's note, Isabella had told her class that Mrs. Sarah helps people get their homes back when bad people steal them, and she made sure my daddy learned to be good again. The innocent wisdom of a child who understood that justice could coexist with mercy, that punishment could lead to redemption, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to fight for what was right. The mansion in Riverside Hills that Marcus and Natasha had planned to share was eventually sold by the federal government, with the proceeds going to victim compensation. But the legacy of their relationship wasn't the destruction they had initially caused. It was the investigation that had grown from my discovery of Marcus's betrayal into a systematic examination of judicial corruption that had protected thousands of families from future victimization. Sometimes I drive past our old house in Maplewood Heights, the colonial where I had played the role of perfect wife while Marcus orchestrated crimes I never suspected. The current owners have maintained the garden I had planted and the renovations we had completed together, but it no longer feels like a monument to a failed marriage. Instead, it represents the starting point of a journey that had led me to discover capabilities I never knew I possessed, and to build a life based on my own choices, rather than someone else's expectation. The ordinary housewife who had received that devastating phone call had evolved into someone who could take down federal judges, recover hundreds of millions of dollars for victims, and help reform legal institutions to prevent future corruption. But more importantly, she had learned that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable, and when they chose to use their pain as motivation to protect others from similar harm. Marcus had been right about one thing. I had deserved better than the life we had built together. But he had been wrong about everything else. I wasn't too ordinary for success. I had simply been applying my extraordinary abilities to supporting someone else's dreams, instead of pursuing justice for people who needed protection from criminals who exploited their trust. The real victory wasn't the prison sentences imposed on corrupt judges or the millions of dollars recovered for victims. The real victory was the knowledge that when tested by the worst betrayal imaginable, I had chosen to become someone who made the world more just, rather than simply seeking personal revenge. That was the legacy I wanted to leave for Sabella and for the countless other families whose lives had been improved by the pursuit of justice over vengeance, protection over punishment, and extraordinary courage in the face of ordinary evil. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.